Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome back to those of you that have joined us over the past couple of weeks, and also a very warm welcome of those of you that are joining us today for your first installment of our inaugural Tradeshift virtual event experience, The Paradigm Shift. Hopefully you're having a beautiful start to your day. I, for one, am quite content here being in my windowless workspace today, given that we're in the midst of our very first heat wave up here in Toronto, which is amazing considering we had light snow just a couple of weeks ago. I'm Christy Kaler, and I lead the Global Partner Marketing Program here at Tradeshift. So before we get started, I just wanted to call your attention to the screen. Again, we have our extremely talented graphic recorder, Jai, capturing the event. Jai joins us from SketchFX, and he will be visually summarizing the session. And today's masterpiece will be sent out during tomorrow's wrap-up, and you will also get the final canvas with all 5 pieces at the end of the program. So we've made it to the halfway mark. I hope you were all able to tune into last week's incredibly engaging panels. I know the sentiment from many of the attendees that we talked with, as well as the panelists, was that the debate could have continued on and we all wanted more. We discussed resiliency and adaptability, long-term sustainability, and the impact to culture and experience. And I hope you felt the same way that I did, and that they were incredibly insightful, both from a personal and a professional perspective. So let us move into week 3, which is the lab. Just a couple of very quick housekeeping notes before we start. Of course, we'll continue on with our mantra here at Tradeshift, which is shift happens. So if shift does happen and there are any tech glitches, please sit tight and we'll be right back. And also, of course, a friendly reminder again that we will be continuing our scavenger hunt. So if you haven't yet accessed that, you will find the details right on the registration page. Today's program is going to be about the how, and you're going to hear from our customers and colleagues about how they're navigating this shift. So we would like to encourage you to keep the conversation going during and after today's sessions through Twitter and use the hashtag #ParadigmShift. Now let's dive in. So the format today will start with an opening keynote from Tony Alvarez, who is Tradeshift's very own VP of Network. Tony is going to be talking about the importance of seller value and also how the current crisis is illuminating that more. Next, we will move into our breakout sessions for the day. The first 2 options, one each led by our customers, Tammy Johnson from First Advantage, as well as Rock Prasad from Take Two, will be a little bit more interactive, so you can turn your cameras on, ask questions, and please be part of the discussion. Also, our third option, led by our Chief Product Officer, Rafi Brez, will walk you through our Tradeshift product roadmap. Just a quick reminder again, if you haven't selected your breakout on how you can join, if you go to the agenda webpage, you can click on the broadcast button for the session that you will see there right under the headers. And choose the session that you'd like to attend. So now without further ado, Tony, take the stage.
Awesome, thanks Christy. And let me do a screen share here. And hopefully everything is working okay. So once again, thanks for the opportunity. My name's Tony Alvarez. I am relatively new to Tradeshift. I joined Tradeshift at the beginning of the year, and but not new to the space. The prior 10 years before that, I worked for SAP Ariba, and I've been on pretty much every side of the table. I was there when we introduced the 2-sided business model for the network. I've been on the sell side. I've been on the buy side. And if you had asked me a few months ago, I would have said I've seen absolutely everything. But over the last few months, I've learned that I have not seen everything, and I will never challenge that assumption again. But again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. My goal is at the end of this presentation that all of you walk out of here convinced that a happy seller is a strategic advantage in your supply chain. And, that's something, seller value is something that we really take a lot of pride in at Tradeshift. And we firmly believe that it is indeed a competitive advantage for all of our enterprise buyers that we work with. So let's go ahead and get started here. Let me see if I can advance the screen there. There we go. So let's start with some of the basics. I think everyone can agree that a supply chain is indeed an ecosystem. And oftentimes it's an incredibly complex ecosystem. Every little part, becomes so acutely important when it messes up. One experience that I've had is my prior life, I worked at Alcoa. we at Alcoa had, we were in the automotive industry. We had a small business called Huck Fasteners. A gentleman overslept, and we did not get a delivery of, literally, it was like a 4.5 cent bolt for the assembly line for Ford, and it literally shut them down for several hours. And if you're in the automotive industry ever, you know that that's tens of $1,000s per hour that you shut someone down. I bring that up again because, the slightest, smallest thing, like a 4.5 cent bolt, can bring an entire supply chain to its knees. You have items like that, and then you also have, what we're living through right now, which certainly tested everyone's supply chain, and I think we're learning a lot from it. And I think, what's important for us to remember is that, within a supply chain, there's many links, and all of those links, by the way, are typically our sellers. Most of us on the phone enjoy the spot of being the enterprise buyer. Typically, that is the spot in the supply chain that, quote unquote, has the most power. And, again, I think what we have to ask ourselves is, when we have that position in the supply chain, or a position of power in supply chain, does the golden rule apply? And, when I say golden rule, there's probably two schools of thought that immediately jump into your head. Is which one? Is it the one that your mom taught you when you were growing up, do unto others as you would have them do unto you? Or is it the one that you learned in procurement school, whoever has the gold rules? So, let's take a quick sidestep here and just use this moment in time, during a pandemic. I love this quote that I found from Ralph Waldo Emerson. This time, like all times, is a very good one, but we know what to do with it. And, here's just an example of, supply chain and in particular supply chain financing, and how various businesses handled it. So Morrison's, a really fantastic grocery chain out of the UK, announced almost immediately that they would be paying all of their small suppliers. So very early on in a pandemic, Morrison's recognized that there was going to be a shortage of cash flow, and immediately released payment for their small suppliers. Shortly after, Unilever, another customer, also what I believe to be a really noble thing, and dedicated nearly $500 million of cash flow relief for its most vulnerable and smallest suppliers, as a part of relief in the cash flow shortage during the pandemic. And contrast that to Witherspoon, which I learned a little bit about it over the last few days. A colleague of mine brought this to my attention, that Witherspoon publicly announced that they were not going to pay their suppliers. That was how they were going to weather the storm during the pandemic. And at first, I was really quick to rush to judgment and compare and contrast to what Morrison's and Unilever did. And I started to soften a little bit. And there's quite a bit of press that went out on Tim Martin. As I understand it, he's not a super, I guess he's a pretty polarizing person. But the more I read into it, and the more I kind of considered the position of a pub and a restaurant during the pandemic that literally had to close down, versus say Unilever or Morrison's that had a little bit more stability or even a tailwind in a pandemic. It made me kind of question, again, my rush to judgment on whether or not, their two strategies were right. But I think one thing that we can all agree on is, there was some intent here, and there was, by Morrison's and Unilever, showed a lot of collaboration and consideration for their ecosystem or their supply chain, whereas I think Witherspoon took a more direct approach and, kind of did a zero-sum game approach. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So how do you want your sellers to think of you? And again, we just went through a pretty, I think, stark example of the two paths that you could have gone on, and probably any number of paths in between. But I think just from our positions in procurement, and again, I would imagine like the vast majority on the phone are in a position of either procurement or accounts payable, dealing every day with sellers. And if you look across the board, traditionally, any kind of procurement application or payable solution is geared towards the buyer. And, you know, it's a little tongue in cheek, 98.7%. I think I am being conservative. Like some would argue 100% of these applications are geared toward the buyer. And, you know, I think that after a while, it can start to wear on your sellers. This is one of my favorite cartoons that a seller had forwarded to me in my prior life. And basically their message was simple. Hey, every single application or feature that you introduce comes out and it's geared for the buyer. And the buyer says that they love it and they think that their sellers are going to love it. But it's really about perspective. You know, if you're talking about a reverse auction or some increased competitive nature or transparency or, you know, beating down on price, et cetera, you know, buyers are going to naturally love that, and sellers are going to have a very different perspective. So at Tradeshift, we definitely like to think differently. And if there's one thing, you know, that I would say to take away from this presentation is this quote right here. So Christian Lang said this when I was coming on board. And I think it articulated what was in my head so perfectly. And this is why I'm so excited to be part of Tradeshift. The most valuable network for the buyer is the most valuable network for the seller. And if you just take a second to unpack that, I think, you know, what is really cool is that Tradeshift's strategy is to make the network a destination, a place that sellers and buyers want to go because they obtain value from doing it. And, you know, it sounds simple, but it is, you know, very unique. And I think it's unique in the marketplace right now. And the other really cool thing is I feel like Tradeshift has a 10-year head start on this. From the very beginning in the design of the network, the way that these business entities are set up on the network, they're not even delineated between a buyer and a seller. It's just the persona that you're utilizing at the time. And the platform is designed very effectively with the use of apps. It is truly a network that is what I would call a fair and balanced B2B commerce platform. So I think that's super exciting. And that's certainly been our strategy at Tradeshift, to create the most valuable network for sellers, because in turn, it becomes the most valuable network for our buyers. So let's take a second here and just go through what kind of seller value is Tradeshift enabling or creating. And I think it falls into three buckets. And you can kind of just complete this sentence. Tradeshift network allows sellers more transparency, more collaboration, and more sales. And let's just go into to each one of these. So transparency. This one is, I think, the most exciting development within the Tradeshift network. And earlier this year, we launched a product called Tradeshift Engage. And Engage for us it's really, I guess, two things. It's one, it's our traditional or legacy onboarding, which in the first place was world-class, but it was very naturally what you would think of as traditional onboarding. An army of people enabling sellers onto the platform, facilitating those connections between a buyer and seller. And when we introduced Engage, we added to that functionality basically a proprietary connectivity between the Tradeshift network and the buyer's ERP. And the really the interesting part about this is that way a seller can obtain value day one. And if you've ever been through a project where you're doing onboarding of sellers, or really onboarding of any kind of platform, timing is everything. And the reason timing was everything was because if you bring on a seller too early and they don't have any transactions, they forget. Obviously, you don't want to bring them on too late. You know, kind of the ship's already passed, or they're slow to get value. And what Engage does, because the first time that they log on, they see up to 2 years of their order and invoice history, they can obtain value day one. And again, it's orders that may or may not have even already passed through the Tradeshift network. They can go back and manage the status of those invoices, again, all the way back for 2 years. Another really, I think, valuable aspect of Tradeshift Engage is because of their ability to go back and look at those transactions. It gives full transparency of the status of the invoice, when it was paid, when it will be paid, and it also gives the seller the ability to participate in early payment programs. So again, you know, at first blush, I think you might look at this and be like, wow, that's a great seller value. What's in it for me as a buyer? And you know, one, I already mentioned, this makes the propensity for a seller to onboard onto the platform and transact with you much more likely, and we've seen proven results on that. We've introduced Engage with a handful of our clients already, and it will be heretofore standard. And the onboarding rates are much higher, and again, it's due to the seller value. A couple other side benefits that aren't quite as obvious that we're finding out is when the seller has this information at their fingertips, the outbound calls, or I guess the inbound calls into the buyer regarding questions on invoices, drops dramatically. So much so that we had a customer that actually was able to reallocate about 50 resources that were tied to inbound questions on invoices to other areas of their business. So that's a nice, you know, byproduct. And then last but not least, having this history allows Tradeshift to have some backdrop for their artificial intelligence and machine learning. And again, it just makes the experience that much better for the buyer and the seller. So that's Tradeshift Engage. One of my favorites, and this isn't even a product, but it's a feature, but you know, again, a seller value that we offer that I think also has great buyer benefits, is just the ability to collaborate real time within the app. And you know, again, at the surface, it's you know, it seems kind of simple, but the fact that you can have a conversation within the app regarding a specific invoice, and that conversation is tied to that specific invoice, is just incredibly efficient and incredibly valuable to both the buyer and the seller. It literally leaves, you know, zero room for error. You're literally talking about, you know, the invoice that's to the right of the message box. And there's also some really cool features as well that allow easier auditing. You can drag and drop, you know, if part of the conversation happened to be outside or an email, you can drag and drop those files directly into the app, and it's tied to that invoice. And, you know, it makes for audit planning much easier. Another huge, I think, you know, selling point that is worth mentioning, and I think Tradeshift has a really unique advantage in our solution called Babelway. So Babelway was an integration technology that we bought a couple of years ago. We had already used them quite a bit, and now use them exclusively to onboard our sellers. And I think the interesting point to take away here is not only does Babelway accommodate the traditional integration, you know, so when you think of large sellers doing high volumes, I think that's, you know, very natural. Babelway does a great job of, you know, allowing those to be, you know, basically ERP to ERP connections. And it certainly takes the vast majority of the volume. Earlier this year, we announced some new functionality within Babelway that allows sellers to convert PDF directly to XML. And when you think about that, it really helps achieve onboarding for what I would call the middle tail. So for those low volume sellers, certainly you can utilize they can utilize the portal. It works well. PO Flip. Obviously, for your high volume ones, you can do a traditional integration. And starting just earlier this year, we started to roll out the PDF to XML capability, and it just opens up functionality for that middle tail, which has been really well received. And again, if you think about the buyer value of that, the fact that those middle tail sellers are able to convert their traditional PDF that they already know how to do. It stays digital. It's not something that is, God forbid, turned into a PDF, printed out, and then scanned in. It stays digital, and again, makes it much more accurate, much more friendly experience for the buyer and the seller. And then last but not least, we want to help sellers sell more. So I know a lot of you in procurement, you probably just felt your wallet twitch a little bit. But we at Tradeshift feel like there is a right way and a way that procurement teams want to be sold to. And effectively, that means, large enterprises want to be sold to, but on their terms. And we're introducing a new feature and functionality called Tradeshift Market, which is complements the already catalog functionality within Tradeshift. And again, when I say kind of traditional catalog functionality, think contract. And Tradeshift Market is going to allow non-contract or marketplace buying on the Tradeshift platform. And the really cool part about this is, again, not only does that add value to the seller because they can earn a greater share of wallet from the buyer, but also the buyer is in control. It's on their terms. They can curate the content as they see fit, and allow sellers or not to display their content in the marketplace format. So, a quick example might be a standard office chair might be something that's contracted, and that would show up at the top. Or maybe, and you're buying hundreds of those. Or maybe, maybe it's a one-time buy of a lobby chair, and that would be easily sourced from one of the marketplace vendors. So, again, I think there's two sides to these coins. A lot of value for the seller that we've designed in, and we haven't forgotten about the buyer. So let's go through, really quickly the inventory that we just discussed. Supply chain doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Like our friend Tim Martin, his strategy with Weatherspoon, it can be certainly a win-win situation. So all of these things that we talked about, whether it's the transparency on the order history, real-time collaboration, the ability to get early payments and the flexibility there, all the integration options, this build your own marketplace is fantastic for both the buyer and the seller. And last but not least too, Tradeshift is unique in the sense that all of this is offered free to the seller. So it is a huge investment for Tradeshift. We think it's important, again, to make the network a destination, a place that sellers want to go and alleviate friction. And therefore, everything that I just mentioned is free to the seller. So, so Tradeshift allows this functionality and the value on both sides. And in closing, I think there's actually two things that I want you to remember. One, the most important one is the most valuable network for the buyer is the most valuable network for the seller. And then our golden rule is that you can have your cake and eat it too. So again, appreciate the time. I've added my contact details here. I would be happy to answer any questions, or if you want to shoot me an email, or I believe also in the chat, you're able to ask questions and we will follow up with you directly. But thank you again.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tony. The importance of buyer-seller relationships are paramount, so it's really great to see the work that you and your team are doing to create a level playing field for commerce. Before we move on to the breakouts, I am also very excited to share our surprise guest speaker for next week. Drum roll, please. Mr. Aaron Dignan. So Aaron is the renowned author of Brave New Work and also founder of The Ready, where he helps companies large and small adopt new forms of managing constant change through self-organization and dynamic teaming. And if you haven't checked out his podcast as yet, please do so. It's a really great listen. And also his most recent episodes have been focused around team transitions due to the crisis. So it is breakout time. Please select your session, take a short virtual walk over to that room, and we'll be starting in just 1 minute. Have a wonderful rest of your day and enjoy.